Hello again, everybody. Welcome to Herd Immunity News. Today, I've got a fascinating guest for you. Indeed, I have Dr. Stuart Waiton. Dr. Waiton is a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Abertay in Scotland. He is also a journalist, he's a writer, and he has got some amazing things to say and opinions of what's going on in our schools right now. But without any further ado, let me just say, how are you, Stuart?
Yeah, I'm busy.
Very busy. Well, I can imagine. I can imagine you're a busy man. Firstly, let's just go on, if we may. Before I go on, I should say, could you tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself and your background, please?
Yeah, I'm a lecturer at Abertay University in Dundee. I was a youth and community worker before that, living in Glasgow. I'm from Newcastle originally. Politically, I was on the left of politics. And interestingly, all the things that are now taught to children as dogma are the sort of issues that I was interested in. So campaigns against racism, women's equality, gay rights, stuff like that. And then I kind of moved into looking at things to do with overregulation of society and children. So I got interested in things like up here, I think this was happening in England as well, where you got these weird initiatives like head teachers telling parents not to take photographs of nativity plays, right? And this became a thing that you're talking about. Well, it's probably nearly 20 years ago now that you had this sort of stuff. Safer swimming. So I don't know if anyone out there has got a number of small children, and again, I don't know if this happens in England, but in Scotland, you've got a kind of a flow chart of how many adults you need per child, how many water wings, how many so on. So if you're a single parent with 3 small kids, you basically can't take them to the swimming pool because they've got their regulations and so on. So I became interested in that, and I'm interested in all the kind of woke issues because I believe in liberty, I suppose. I believe in freedom and democracy, which is why I ultimately met yourself when I stood for the Brexit Party.
Indeed.
And I'm pro-immigration, but I'm also pro the idea that this should be a democratic decision by the public. And I was horrified, although not that surprised, when the Brexit vote was being constantly undermined by politicians. And I suppose my big fascination at the minute is what I'd call the new elites.
Right.
Which, as an old Marxist, I was always interested in the sort of class divide.
Sure.
And I'm still interested in the class divide, except now I think it's different. I think you now have this 20% blob of academics, intellectuals, cultural elites, and so on, who run every institution with their EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion dogma, and essentially punish anyone who doesn't toe the line. So it's become a fascinating journey for me. I mean, I've always been very critical of the left in lots of ways. But today, I don't know what left means, what right means, but I do know that there's a serious problem with the sort of dogma. And that's why, at the start of the year, to ramble on, I set up the Scottish Union for Education, which is essentially a union for parents, teachers, people in the community who can see that education for kids is now a dogma. I'll give you the worst example of this that I came across, because we now have lots of teachers and parents who are in the union who get in touch with us, write for us. I've got a Substack, so if you go to Scottish Union for Education Substack, you'll find the Substack, which is free, although we like people to subscribe to help fund us, obviously. But the latest story I had was of a nursery school that had culled their books. So they'd got rid of a lot of books that were not seen as correct for 4-year-old children. And one of the books they introduced was Julian as a Mermaid. And if for those who don't know what Julian as a Mermaid is, Pink News describes Julian as a Mermaid as a transgender book, and that's what it is. So you now have nurseries adopting books that promote transgender ideology to 4-year-old children, which I think is horrific. And that's the trans issue is one of the big issues that we've been campaigning around. We've written a pamphlet on it, we've sent it to all the schools, as well as other issues like the obsession with race,
yes,
the denunciation of whiteness, the trashing of history. And I've always been fairly critical of British history, but even I can recognize how one-dimensional and miserable it is, as well as the kind of environmental miserablism. I've just had a brilliant article actually written by a parent about how her 8-year-old child gets pumped with miserable environmental doom, crisis,
yes,
and trains them, which is very interesting. She made the point, and I'll stop rambling after this, but she made the interesting observation, which is one of my kind of preoccupations, is the kind of what I describe as a culture of narcissism.
yes,
That even with the environment issue, what they end up doing is talking about their behavior, right? So it's constantly about almost policing each other. Have you done this? Are you personally being sustainable? How are you getting to school? They check the electricity the school's using to see if, and it becomes this inward focused preoccupation with yourself and your behavior, instead of having education which should be drawing kids out of themselves and out of their self-preoccupation. I think what we now have is kind of institutionalized narcissism, which I think the transgender and identity politics themes fit into. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Well, listen, you're on to give your view, and we've got you on primarily because you're an expert in your field. There is no doubt about that. You're very respected in your field of criminology, but you're also respected for your campaigning for liberty, free speech, and democracy. But if I can just get you to open up a little bit more, you've touched on it already. What is going on in our primary schools, then up to high school, then university, that concerns you the most?
Wow. Well, to start with an abstraction, Lionel Shriver wrote a really good article for Unheard. This is the American novelist who we had on one of our online discussions. We've got Graham Lenihan next, by the way, in case people
are excellent. Yeah, that'll be good for a laugh.
It should be. It certainly should. And she made the observation that what education used to be about was the development, and socialization, in fact, was the development of character. And she says, now it's not about character, it's about the self. And what she's really talking about is that we now have a kind of cultural, moral ethos that the modern elites carry, where the only thing is you, right? There's nothing else. There's just you and yourself and your identity, right? There's nothing bigger than that. It's not broader than that. There's not, religion is problematic. Politics is old school, is problematic. Even cultural norms are problematic, but there is you, the individual. You have to be true to yourself, be the real you. And you can see it in advertising and so on, right? There's this kind of really narcissistic, inward-looking kind of perspective. And I think you can see that throughout education, that this identity, but there's also a profoundly miserable dimension to this. So human society before now is increasingly represented as degraded.
Right.
So I think you can see that in the preoccupation with things like slavery, right? That, what do we learn in school? So I was talking to my daughter's in her early 20s, and she was saying, oh yeah, when she was at school, and this is sort of 6-7 years ago, it was slavery, Martin Luther King, so on. It was kind of almost every issue that she studied was, and Martin Luther King's great, by the way, but the framework of why subjects like that are being discussed is, the degradation of the past. We need to rise above the degradation of the past. So no sense of where democracy comes from, no sense of the ideas of liberty, of liberalism, of the Enlightenment, of the potential for human progress, and so on. And so that's what you get within geography, for example. So geography's now transformed itself into discussions about sustainability. And it's very interesting talking to a number of parents, issues that I'd never really thought about, where they're concerned about a primary school level. There's almost like a constant campaign around crisis, right? So it's like the flooding in Pakistan, crisis. This many people are drowning, this many people are dying, and so on. And it's almost like adult preoccupations of sort of social justice warriors are being dumped onto children at a younger and younger age.
Are they being traumatized by this?
Well, that's another problem, you see, is that I don't like the language of trauma, because I think one of the key new developments is that we've got what's called a therapeutic culture. And actually that it's part of the collapse of both moral and political views and outlooks, is that we now use the language of psychiatry to explain everyday life. So you need bereavement counseling, rather than you're just sad because someone's died or you are traumatized by, and so on. So I try never to use the term trauma.
I think you prefer indoctrination.
Well, I think children can be upset by this.
Yes.
Right? I mean, the funny thing is that if you ask children about their experience of life, they will use the word trauma and depression. And the reason they use the term trauma and depression is that they're taught it at school. So children from a very young age, which is again part of this preoccupation with the self, right? That it's all inwardly directed.
Yeah, exactly.
Part of the inward directed thing is about your emotional well-being and so on. So the idea of mental health, mental well-being, trauma, and you get a medicalized framework that develops from that. ADHD, dyslexia. Yeah, a third of kids in Scotland now have got additional support needs, right? Which means that they've got some kind of label attached to them that confuses a lot of the time what is basic difficulties of discipline, self-discipline, and so on. So I think one of the things I would say what's happened in education is self-discipline, and the need for self-discipline is being replaced by the idea of self-esteem. Which again is a kind of inward focused self-preoccupation. So yes, to answer your question without being pompous about therapy culture, I think a lot of children are being made miserable and unhappy by the kind of crisis, extremism, and the dumping of adult concerns on the children, which is what I think is happening in schools at the minute.
It's crazy. And Richard Lucas, who's the head of the Scottish Family Party, a person that we know, well, to a certain extent, we know him. When he was being interviewed here, Stuart, he said that in Scotland especially, adults are being treated like children and children are being treated like adults. And can I just bring you on to the subject of the sexualization of children in schools, please? And this has come about through parents that have got in touch with us here at Herd Immunity News, and they've shared with us some of the questionnaires that are being asked prepubescent children. Can I have your thoughts on why the school or the government would have a sort of predilection towards children's sexual... Now, you are a criminologist, so you understand this thinking, so you can dissect this and break this down.
Well, actually, I would honestly say that I haven't really got to the bottom of this, because if you look at the United Nations, for example, they now talk about sexuality education. So they don't talk about sex education, they talk about sexuality education.
Okay.
And they are genuinely, and again, I'm slightly horseshoeing this potentially into my own kind of broader thesis of the world.
Please.
But part of the inward turn and this kind of narcissistic culture, added with identity politics, added on top of that, the idea, the sexual liberation of the 70s, which is heralded today, LGBT, blah, 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 etc., etc. That's kind of, I mean, that flag now has taken over the Union Jack kind of thing, as that's the flag of pride. You put the pride flag up to show that you're a good person. So all of that together has in the minds of our elites, I think, made them believe that sexuality and your sex life and your sexual identity is the core of your being, right?
At 5 years old.
Yeah, well, and actually in the UN, the UN sexuality education talks about how there is a sexuality of children from 0 to 4.
There is another word, sorry to jump in, but there are other words. There is another term for people that have got a predilection for prepubescent children. Do you know what that word is, Stuart?
I do, but I always try not to use it, because I think even though I can sympathize and recognize that there is a problem, I think I would prefer to say that they are sexualizing childhood. Most of the people doing it, the vast majority of the people doing it, are not pedophiles or have an inclination towards wanting to have sex with children or whatever. However, what this creates is a breakdown of the understanding of adulthood and childhood, which is part of what I suspect Richard Lucas was talking about, which is that you have an adultification of children and an infantilization of adults. So adults are less and less comfortable with getting old and being mature and experienced and so on. These words are kind of problematic. Whereas being youthful, being young, and so on, these things are celebrated and have been for a number of generations now. And then you have this crossover where with children, there is a confusion about what is a child. And even for some people, you get a curious body of writers and thinkers who talk about the very concept of childhood is oppressive, right? Because that means you have adult power. You know, there's this constant talk about power and abuse the powerful, blah, 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 which is always fascinating, as these people are the ones in power who always use the term power. But there's a critique of adulthood, just like there is of heteronormativity and every other norm, that undermines the idea of being an adult. But this is something that developed out of the 1960s and is part of a wider societal confusion about moral values, I think, and what it means to be an adult. And anyway, so we end up in this very, very confused situation where you look at the material. So it's trickled down, obviously, over decades, generations. And you now have these activist groups set up who are very influential, who have this kind of as an ideology. And then you end up with this sex education for kids, and you look at it, and, you know, I'm a very liberal-minded type person. And I look at some of this stuff and you think, wow, that's insane. And, you know, I mean, Richard Lucas had a hilarious run-in with John Swinney, which he videoed on this very subject, where he's essentially reading from the curriculum to a group at a meeting, and the chair is clutching her pearls. Please, you mustn't say that. You mustn't say that. You say, I'm just reading from the kids.
Exactly. It's not fit. It's not fit for a room full of adults, but it's fit for 7 and 8 year old children to read about. He was reading out the chocolate being the banana being dipped into chocolate, which is basically talking about anal sex.
Yeah.
For 7 and 8 year olds.
That was for high school kids. That one. That was for high school.
Let's listen. It's been read to younger children than that. I hate to inform you.
Yeah, well, I suspect that may well be true.
Yeah, because what I'm going to get at, I know you're sort of saying it's sort of well intended to talk to very young children about their sex lives, but I think you can certainly see those parents that are very concerned, and they're not only concerned, Stuart. They want to withdraw their children from this sort of activity, not just for religious grounds, but for moral and ethical grounds.
I actually don't think it's well intended.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
No, I don't. I think the drive behind this is that the modern elites think that ordinary people are backward bigots, and that their children need to be trained out of their norms, right? So heteronormativity and so on. Right? These are all seen as oppressive. This is the kind of the logic, right? So you've got an oppressive patriarchal society, a heteronormative society. These norms are forced onto the individual and the individual self, and you need to liberate that self with these new norms and values as they see them, one of which is to liberate children and allow them to explore themselves and their sexuality.
But that's not for teachers to do. That's for the parents to do.
Of course it's not. It absolutely has. It should have nothing to do with teachers at all. And all this stuff detracts from education. I mean, that's the tragedy, especially in Scotland, where education's going down the toilet.
It is, and if I can just bring in, this is a big one about the drag queen story time. Now, these are independent private companies that are being brought in to schools in Scotland and in England and Wales and Northern Ireland. And when teachers have requested, Stuart, that they get to see the material that the children are being taught, it's refused. Now, surely to goodness, this is the parent's right to actually demand and request whatever you want, whatever way you want to put it, to see what their children are being taught by drag queens. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, and we're trying to develop certain positions and policy proposals around issues like this. I mean, my proposal would that you should get rid of external educators. It's teachers and schools that should be educating children. And I suspect for a lot of teachers, they incorporate these groups because they don't want to teach it themselves. And the reason they don't want to teach it themselves is because it's creepy and weird. And I mean, I keep using this term, but I just think it's true. A lot of this stuff is creepy and weird and intrusive. And what you're really finding is a kind of colonization of the private life of children.
Yes.
So instead of having an adult world with education and with parents, and then children engaging with that, but also children having free time where they interact with each other, develop their own sort of cult, try and work things through themselves. What used to be called rites of passage, that's now basically being rubbed away. And the most private and intimate dimension of a child's life is being occupied by these experts who are confusing, problematizing, and creating this kind of really miserable idea about what a relationship is. They're really degrading children and undermining that process that should be part of a natural process of growing up. So yes, so everywhere I look, there's problems in education, I have to say.
It is quite startling and very, very frightening for anyone looking at the direction of travel where we are going with education, and it's at universities as well. When I walk into universities, I'm confronted with this array of flags, something that George Orwell couldn't come up with, about where to look, what to think, which direction you should be walking. Some of them have still got the COVID arrows down. They've never let go of that, have they? No. They are totally fixed on running some sort of dictatorship in universities where free opinion and thought is a crime.
Yeah, it's a constant battle within education. I mean, it's a curious one, because at a certain level, academics have a fair amount of freedom, because it's not as if someone's constantly hanging over their shoulder. And the nature of being an academic is that universities really have to allow you the freedom to develop your own curriculum to a certain extent. What they are doing, however, is incorporating things like the decolonization of the curriculum. Right. So you'll find lecturers getting emails saying, "Oh, have you decolonized your curriculum?" Essentially meaning, have you thought about the excessive whiteness of authors and thinkers and even yourself, and have you come to terms? So unconscious bias training is just, accept we just do that. On you go, click away on the correct boxes. I've done my unconscious bias training and so on. Yeah. Of course, they think it's all within the framework of being inclusive and diverse. which is, what's really insidious about it is they take all the best aspects of liberalism,
right?
People's belief in equality, people's opposition to racism, people's opposition to sexism, people's opposition to homophobia and things like that. And they take that and they repackage it through this equality, diversity, inclusion framework, which actually, when you explore it, is really the opposite of what it seems.
Yes.
So, the anti-racism now is, in many respects, racism, because they talk about blackness as something separate, whiteness as something separate, as you've got these different communities, and they're really set in stone in a way that, an old-fashioned racist would be quite proud of the critical race theory approach to things.
Stuart, sorry to interrupt, but recently, I don't know if you saw in the news that London Mayor Sadiq Khan commented on a picture of white mum and dad, 2 white children, walking down the Thames with a London Eye in the back, and his office or himself or whoever put it out there said, not representative of London. Now, switch that around and give it to someone, say, like Nigel Farage. For black people walking down the Thames, Nigel says, this doesn't represent my London. How quickly would he be thrown in jail?
Yeah.
But it's open season now. It seems that someone from the BAME communities, the black and ethnic minorities, and a lot of them don't like being labelled that. We spoke to Ben Habib from the Reform Party, and he said he was disgusted by it. It seems now there's a free pass to say anything about someone white, like yourself and myself. But if you mention anything about anyone of colour, you're in massive trouble. Where is this going? Where do we go with this?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's part of the kind of it's part of the shaming of the past and history, so that all problems are lumped onto the past in a very one-dimensional and uncritical and unthinking way. In fact, it's funny because adverts are always interesting. That the number of adverts where it has to be mixed race or all ethnic minority or minority ethnic and so on. I was watching an advert the other day, and there was a white guy with white kids, and I thought, oh, right, this is novelty, right? Yeah. And of course, I realized while watching it. In fact, I'll tell you what the advert was about and see if you can work out why this. So the advert was about kitchen cleaning materials.
Okay.
Right. So can you work out why it was you might have a white man with white kids in an advert for kitchen materials?
I dread to say. Please tell me. You help me out.
I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
And I'd stake my reputation, what little that it may be, on this. It was an advert where you have a man doing what is traditionally seen as a woman's job. Right. So what you want to do, as you'd want to do with everything, is train white man about what you should be, i.e., you should be doing women's work, right, as described, right? There is no such thing as women's work, particularly, and so on, as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, things that women might do a bit more than men. And that's why they can have, I tell you what, we'll have a white guy. So we don't need a black guy for that, because actually we want to train the white guy that he should not be a kind of heteronormative, old-fashioned man. So there you go, that's all right. So they purposely have the white guy for that advert, Similarly, in fact, there's another one. What was the one? It's
what do you think about Sadiq Khan's comments? You're a criminologist.
Yeah.
Right? That does that not contravene the Equalities Act? Is that not attack on white families because of their skin colour?
Yeah,
well, an offence.
I don't like the Equalities Act.
Okay, well, is it not an offence anyway to white families? You don't be a sackable offence.
Well, I think the way around this is that you need to be part of a protected characteristic, right? That's part of the. So I'm opposed to the whole idea of protected characteristics, because I think they're degrading and patronising. So every gay person is a vulnerable person, supposedly. Every woman is a vulnerable person. Every black person is a vulnerable person. you know, it's like it's old-fashioned racist and sexist stereotypes revitalized through this language, right? So it's like, you know, you get these, you know, not the 9 o'clock news or whatever it's called. You always take the mick out of these old judges who didn't know what a video recorder was and so on, had these backward ideas and thought women were all frail,
yes,
oh, the frail little woman, etc.
yeah.
Whereas now, in law, we're meant to treat women as frail little women because they're part of the protected characteristics and they're vulnerable, right? And we're meant to see black people
What is a woman, Stuart?
vulnerable.
What is a woman? According to
What is
Keir
a
Starmer, a woman can have a penis. Did you know that?
yeah? Well, I'd
What
have
is a
to.
woman? Please tell me. What is a woman? Give me the definition of a woman.
Woman is an adult human female. It's very straightforward. It's
You
biological.
right-wing extremist.
I know there are two sexes and no genders. Yeah, that is my opinion. And the
Ladies and
interesting thing,
gentlemen, there we have criminologist.
the interesting thing about schools is even if people developing education think that I'm wrong, right? If they think there are 100 genders and that you can be born in the wrong body and so on, right? They should, following their own rules and logic and how pedagogy works, they should recognize that this is a controversial issue that is not settled. So they should not be treating it as a fact. And by treating it as a fact, they're actually breaking the law as far as I can tell, right? Because this is not allowed. You do not incorporate politics and ideology as dogma without having a contested idea. So I would be absolutely in favor of 14, 15, 16-year-olds having debates and discussions about what is transgenderism, what is gender, what is biological sex, and hearing all the different arguments inside. I think that would be great, right? The chances of that happening in schools are almost zero. That's because right. It's now developed around a morality where they say you're not being inclusive, you're bullying, you're undermining people's identity and so on. And so they just shut people down, which is a huge problem, as you say, in terms of universities. It's the ethos, it's this ethos which is really dangerous. It's not any particular policy. It's the ethos of inclusion, which essentially understands people as vulnerable with protected characteristics, and certain ideas, words and so on are now understood to be triggering, to be harmful, to be excluding. And once you have that package, you just have a censorious climate. And it's really self-censorship becomes the problem, because academics become terrified of saying something, of using incorrect words, perhaps even not adopting pronouns and so on, because they will then be seen as someone who's bullying, who's harassing, who's non-inclusive and so on. That's the underlying problem that we have.
Well, it's an underlying problem that's expanding out into wider society in every function of government and all their establishments. But if I could just draw your attention to a story that we heard in the news from Bournemouth, and this was due to this action, this public space protection order, which has been put out there. And this was a gentleman in Bournemouth. Now, we can't name him because there's still an ongoing case, but he was outside and getting into some private prayer as a Christian. And he was obviously pointed out by someone, member of the public. The police came over, they asked him what he was praying. Now, this is beyond the Orwellian stuff that we're talking about before. This sort of science fiction films were made of this stuff, weren't they? You know, that you would think Matt Damon would be starring in this one. So they're actually predicting a crime before it happens, but they're asking the man what he's thinking. And you mentioned before there's an attack on Christianity, also family values. The police now feel that they can get away with this stuff, don't they? Because they're almost above reproach. How do we get a hold of this and stop the police going down this totalitarian?
Yeah, well, Harry Miller's been very useful on some of these issues.
Yes, he has.
Ex-police officer. He's challenged the hate crime incident idea, that where the police record a non-crime hate incident. So he's been quite successful on this. I think the law, in terms of the classic dimensions of the law, are quite important because they're set in stone and they still exist. The idea of justice, the idea of what a law actually is and what it should be,
yes,
is something that you've still got the potential to hold on to these sort of ideas and to shame the police, because the police are overreaching. That's the thing on this. So there's these, you can see these YouTube clips in Glasgow, for example, where you've got these street preachers, often working class guys who are preaching, and you've got a little cabal of young people who are described as the kind of LGBTQ kind of a little army turn up and try and say to him, "What do you think about homosexuality? What do you think about homosexuality?" Right, and kind of force him. And this guy saying, "I love all people. I love everyone. We're all sinners. We're all sinners. Yeah, what do you think about homosexuality?" And they force him to say that he thinks homosexuality is a sin. And then they go and get the police, and the police pick him up, chuck him in the van. But he hasn't actually broken the law, so they're then just released. So the punishment is in the process, and it's actually the arrest, the intimidation, and so on. So there is this, which people are recognizing and very conscious of now, that this kind of police guidance framework, the police are almost acting as a kind of a thing in themselves beyond the law, where they develop their own guidance, which is all informed by all this human resources, EDI, inclusive kind of stuff. In fact, I've got somewhere over there, I've got the manual that you train Scottish police with. It's about this fat, which I've printed off, and the first 56 pages are about diversity.
My God.
So that's and interestingly, I've been recently getting information fed to me by someone who's doing teacher training, and the first book they are told to buy, I've probably got it in my bag. I haven't, unfortunately. But anyway, the first book they're bought to buy is about social justice, which argues, and it's the only book they've been asked to buy, it's a social justice book that argues that teachers should be activists, and that their job is to teach social justice. And so teachers, so you're getting it in the police, you're getting the new guidance framework, and you're getting it in teaching. It'll probably be something similar in the civil service. So all these kind of institutions where you get the modern elites, they're all adopting social justice as a framework. This is not their job.
Absolutely. Well, look, we were speaking to Howard Cox, the Reform Party London Mayor, the other day, and he gave us the shocking revelation, and this came out under Information Disclosure Act, Public Information Disclosure Act, and they found out that 95% of crimes in London are unresolved, and 95% of available police are in the office, not on the street, because they've got a predilection, get back to that word again, to focus on people's sexual acts and sexual behaviors. Why are we waving flags that celebrate sodomy? Or why are we waving flags that basically celebrate a sexual act between two people in the privacy of their own home? Why are we not waving flags for blowjobs or cunnilingus? I mean, it's as ridiculous as that. I hate to be blunt and brutal, but isn't it as just ridiculous that we?
Well, I as someone who campaigned for gay rights, I think the fact that we now have people not being arrested for being gay is great.
We're going beyond gay rights now, aren't we?
Well, we have, and that's what becomes interesting. In fact, I would say that it's the LGB isn't really in the flag anymore, right? That flag is really much more about the T and the Q and the I.
Well, and the plus. As you said, I've read your website, and I encourage everybody to go and look at Dr. Waiton's website, because he's actually been in touch with gay and lesbian groups that want nothing to do with this LGBTQ plus, because they say, look, you're destroying our battle and our fight. Please.
Yeah, well, the LGB Alliance has been set up, and they're superb. There's a guy called Malcolm Clark who writes a brilliant blog who actually unpicks in great detail and explains the kind of history of the weirdness of the kind of transgender doctors, psychiatrists, and surgeons from the 1950s and 60s, who have kind of like, we're always in the background, but that kind of framework has been adopted, and that outlook of this idea that you should uncritically think that people mutilating themselves, and having a lifetime of drugs and confusion, really, about who they are and what they are, is now celebrated. I mean, it is remarkable, really, that I hope that in a generation's time, this period will be looked back upon with great shame, and it'll be seen as a form of state-sponsored child abuse that's taking place.
I hope it is, actually. I hope we drop it, but there seems to be more and more and more of this. I mean, there's things like the ESG, the environmental social governance, all these the top companies in our country, universities, churches have all signed up to this indoctrination, as I think you've called it in your writings. And you speak out against this and you're ostracized. You speak out against this and you're now right-wing extremists. Now, you've said before you're politically, you're to the left. But with what you're saying, they're now placing you out the left. This isn't about left or right. For me, this is about control. It's about totalitarianism. And no matter how much they smear us, you'll know this. You were a Brexiteer from the left as well. No matter how much they smear us, they won't win, will they? They won't win. They won't silence us, is what I'm saying.
No, well, it's such a curious time politically, because you do have a situation where you have, I would say, around about 20% of people are dogmatic around these values. But then you've probably got at least 60, possibly 70, possibly more percent of the population who, if you talk to them about it, they wouldn't be into it, right? So they would not be into the idea that you should be teaching primary children about transgenderism, right? They would not think that this idea of whiteness and white privilege is a useful idea. I think a lot of them would even be thinking that there's something a bit wrong about the way environmentalism is approached and promoted in such a kind of dogmatic and miserable way. And I think on more and more issues, you get this division from the people who are running things and the rest of the population, which, I mean, that's a fascinating position.
Can I just get you, please, on the mind of a sociopath? Now, I'm not saying that the people who are doing all these things are sociopaths, but when you are trying to condition someone to do things against their will, you create this false world for them, almost like a holographic society where nothing is real. They question everything. And add the net zero in, please, Stuart, to the identity crisis that children are going through. Are they a boy? Are they a girl? They're questioning now their forebears, like the Second World War, First World War, colonialism, slavery. These little children are being left. I won't use the word traumatized because that's my word. This is my speech. You're now telling me what I could say and what I could think. See, you're following that trap. But on a serious note, you see the picture that's being painted here. So as a criminologist and someone that recognized what a sociopath would do, can you see an alliance between the sociopathic mind and where government are taking us as a society?
Yeah, I think I'd jump more onto the narcissist, which you could say a narcissist has got sociopathic inclinations potentially, because you see what's very interesting about the idea of narcissism is the fragility of it. And I mean, not to over talk on the subject of transgenderism, but it's just an interesting thing, is one of the dimensions of not just transgenderism, but it's this, in fact, a number of people made this useful observation that you now say, I identify as, right? Now, people didn't used to say that. People just said, I am, right? So they would say, I'm a husband, I'm a socialist, I'm a conservative, I'm a Christian. It's just what you were, right? Or I'm working class, or I'm a union man, or whatever, right? Because it was grounded, right? It was grounded in real relationships, in society, in something much bigger than you as an individual. But today you don't say that. You say, I identify as, and you can tell in the very use of that term that there is a profound fragility to that identity. Because if you identify as something, well, perhaps the next day you might identify as something else. It's very internal. It's very self-preoccupied. It's also it's almost recognizing that they're struggling with their identity.
Yes.
And you can see that obviously this is the case with the trans issue, which is why you get such a kind of reaction, right? A sort of screaming, hysterical type reaction to anyone who just, like J.K. Rowling, for example, who just says, well, I just think biology is real and that's important and women's spaces are important. Transphobe, you bitch, you
TERF,
TERF, etc., etc. Right? And the reason that you get that reaction, I think, is because underlying it, there's a recognition that this new identity and these new identities are profoundly fragile, right? Yes. Profoundly fragile and not stable, which is why you seem to get this kind of reaction to the need for law. You know, you didn't need a million laws to enforce things in the past because things had a grounding. Whereas now you don't really have things that are grounded. You know, anything that's grounded has been sort of swept away. Norms, they're oppressive, etc., etc. So you get a kind of hyper-relativism, hyper-individualism, and a really unstable, fragile type of society developing. But that is from a sociological perspective.
Yes, you very politically dodged that question. You would have been a fantastic politician.
I
was trying to get your alliance. I was trying to get to draw the comparisons between the mind of the sociopath and the mind between people constructing our society in such a malevolent way, in my eyes, because whether it's willful malevolence or whether it's ignorance, the results are the same. It's a distinction without a difference. And there's so many people now in society, and you know this very well, Stuart, that are terrified about what their children are going through, so much so that they're thinking of homeschooling.
Oh yeah.
What do you think about that? More people are looking at, what are your thoughts on homeschooling before we wrap up in about 5 minutes?
Yeah. Up here they like to call it home educating rather than
home educating. I'm sorry about that.
That's not my distinction. It's just I've been told that recently. I again spoke to a parent at the weekend while I was driving down to Newcastle, who is got this exact dilemma. All the things you're talking about, the sex education stuff in schools, the trans stuff in schools, she's seen all this in primary school. She's been to her MP, been to her MSP, total disregard, given the runaround. Teachers and even head teachers who recognize that there is something a bit inappropriate about this, but then go on to argue that, well, you've got the internet, so kids see this stuff, so we have to blah blah blah. So that's one of the kind of excuses that they use. Right. And she's been forced into a position now where she's thinking, well, I'm either having to educate my kids myself or go to a private school, and I don't know if I can afford that. And this is a terrible, terrible situation that parents are actually being forced into this thing. Of course, the problem is I'm then talking to somebody else who says, well, you should be looking at Dundee High School, which is the good private school in Dundee, right, where apparently they allow boys to use girls' toilets. So part of my role as the chairperson of the Scottish Union for Education, I have now emailed Dundee High School and asked them if this is true and if this is their official policy. And if it is, do they recognize that they might be breaking the law?
Yes.
So yes, I think there's whatever you want to call it. It's
I know what we could call it, but I won't say it for our discerning viewers in Belgravia, or maybe Morningside, for our lovely viewers in Morningside and Jesmond, if we're going to Newcastle.
Indeed.
I don't want to upset those. But look, we've got a couple of minutes left, if that's okay. I would love to get you back on the show because you touched on a subject that I think is also a big concern of yours, and that's climate change. And that's this, it's lunacy in my eyes, and it's become zealotry. The new religion is a religion of climate change. If you put the LGBTQ+ in there as well, But what we're seeing now is people nailing themselves to the road, lying in front of traffic, putting themselves and other people at risk. In the last couple of minutes, how do you think that we address this with our young?
Yeah, well, again, I mean, one of the objectives of the Scottish Union for Education is to promote the idea that what schools need to be is they need to be about education, not indoctrination. So we could agree or disagree on all sorts of issues, but we should at least be able to accept that the point of schools is knowledge.
Right.
Point of school is to educate. Facts. Point of schools is that they should be subject based. So when you're teaching geography, you should be teaching geography. You shouldn't be teaching climate change. Or if you are, you should be teaching it within a framework of a debate and a discussion rather than dogma.
Yes.
And I think that's really important to try, and because then at least you can promote it positively. You know, we want the best that has been ever thought and said, right? That's what we want for our children. We want the bar to be as high as possible. Within that framework, we need to have schools that have got the idea of discipline and self-discipline and subject-based knowledge being a priority, because this stuff is brilliant. This stuff is what has created the modern world. All of the developments that we have in our life and the technology has been developed through a modern liberal education system, which allows freedom of thought, belief, and tries to adopt what are the best ideas and the best novelists and the best understanding of history and the development of geography and so on. And that's what we need to get back to. We need to, because that's a positive thing. It's not just a kind of reaction against a kind of woke takeover. We can say, okay, we can react to certain things, but what's your alternative? Well, this is the alternative. This is much more enlightened. This is much more uplifting for children. And this, the framework of environmentalism, you're right, it is like a religion, and it is a seriously degraded, crisis-ridden dumping onto children the responsibilities of the world. And I mean, I've always understood from my kind of, if you like, from my Marxist background, I always understood that development comes through growth. Right. The reason that you get a modern liberal society is because we've grown and developed. We've had an industrial, we've been able to flourish to such an extent that you're able to develop an understanding of individuals, individual rights, freedoms, and so on. All of this has come because you've had massive economic growth, and problems are solved by that. Problems, and I'm sure there are environmental problems, right? I'm not an environmental scientist, I'm just going to accept at the minute that the temperature is rising a bit. I'm not going to accept that it's to the extent that it's hysterically promoted by Greta and the boiling world and all the rest of it. But let's just accept that, there is an issue here that needs to be resolved at a certain level. How do I think it will be resolved? I think it will be resolved by using the resources we have as efficiently as we can, and by developing science and technology that can overcome any of the issues that we need to, like that what we've been doing for the last 200 years. That's how progress happens. It's not by trying to rein everybody in, so everyone's like rifling through their bins and being preoccupied.
Yeah, the ULEZ is going on right now, which I'm focused on, and there's people are taking direct democracy in their own hands. They're taking measures and they're doing things to. It's almost like the poll tax. You remember the 1990 poll tax? Whether you were left wing, right wing, I remember my mum and dad tearing it up, throwing it in the fire. They never paid a penny piece towards it, and they were probably right wingers. But it was something that just brought everybody together. There was no right and left. It was just what is right, and they all turned their back on it, and it really finished off Mrs. Thatcher, as it turns out. But we won't get into that. But listen, in the last few seconds or a minute that we've got left, where can the Herds Immunity News subscribers and followers get you? Where can they find you?
Well, the best thing is to go to the Scottish Union for Education Substack, which you can find.
We will leave the links to all of that, by the way, Stuart.
We'll
leave the links. But so the Scottish Union for Education.
Scottish Union for Education Substack, and you just type that in, it'll come up. We're now in, I think this is our 30th week. Wow. And so we've got a load of stuff that's there. We've met a lot of parents and teachers who now write for us on all of these subjects. And as I say, we'll be having a discussion with Graham Lenihan at
He's the writer, he's the comedy writer of Father Ted, was it?
He is indeed the guy who was cancelled in Edinburgh because you know, he thinks that men have
Go
been
on, go on, go on.
exactly.
That's a terrible impression.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. Anyway, so that's the best place to go, and do subscribe if you can, and help us to build, because basically we need new institutions. The old institutions, the old unions, all of these bodies have been captured. We need new institutions, and we're trying to set up and create a parent-teacher institution to challenge indoctrination in schools.
Fantastic. Very well said indeed. Very well said indeed. All that remains for me to do from Herd Immunity News is thank so much Dr. Stuart Waiton to give us some of his precious time. We will leave all the links to his fantastic sites. Please check him out. Get involved. We seriously recommend that you read the information that he's got. Thank you very much, Stuart, for joining us at Herd Immunity News, sir.
Thank you.